Emily Rodriguez had perfected the art of appearing ordinary. Behind her warm smile and professional demeanor at Chen & Associates law firm lay a secret that had haunted her for 5 years. Every morning, she sat at her reception desk in the gleaming lobby of downtown Chicago's most respected legal practice, greeting clients with practiced ease, while her conscience slowly devoured her from within. She had built her entire adult life around one terrifying moment of weakness, one split-second decision that changed everything. Today, that carefully constructed facade would crumble when her past walked through the front door, demanding justice she never thought she'd have to face.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chen & Associates, casting long shadows across the marble lobby where Emily Rodriguez arranged fresh flowers with meticulous care. At 28, she had become the embodiment of professional excellence, her reputation built on an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs, solve problems, and maintain an atmosphere of calm efficiency that made even the most anxious clients feel at ease. Every detail of her appearance was calculated to project competence and trustworthiness. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, her smile genuine enough to disarm the most skeptical visitor. The partners at the firm often remarked that Emily was irreplaceable, the kind of employee who made everyone else's job easier simply by existing in their orbit. But perfection, Emily had learned, was exhausting. The weight of her secret pressed against her chest every morning as she unlocked the office doors, every afternoon as she organized files, every evening as she locked up and walked to her car. 5 years ago, on a rainy November night that she relived in vivid detail during sleepless hours, Emily had made a choice that transformed her from a carefree college senior into someone who measured every word, every action, every breath against the possibility of discovery. She had been 23 then, celebrating her friend's birthday at a downtown bar. Too many drinks, too much laughter, too much confidence in her ability to handle anything life threw at her. The rain had started just as you left the bar, and she should have called a cab, should have asked for a ride, should have made any decision other than the one that led to her sliding behind the wheel of her Honda Civic with reflexes dulled by alcohol and judgment clouded by youth. The accident happened on Ashland Avenue, just 3 blocks from her apartment. A man in a dark coat had stepped into the crosswalk without looking, or perhaps you had run the light. The details remained frustratingly unclear even in her memories. The impact was sickeningly soft, a sound she would never forget, followed by the scrape of fabric against metal and the horrible silence that came after. Emily had sat in her car for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, watching the man roll to a stop on the wet asphalt. He wasn't moving. Rain drummed against her windshield, and her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the steering wheel. In that moment, terror overwhelmed everything else. Terror of prison, of disgrace, of her parents' disappointment, of a future destroyed before it had truly begun. So she drove away. The next morning brought news reports of a hit and run, a man found unconscious with serious injuries, police seeking witnesses. Emily had locked herself in her apartment for 3 days, emerging only when hunger forced her out, expecting at any moment to hear sirens, to see police cars, to face the consequences of what she had done. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and somehow, impossibly, she was never caught. The guilt, however, proved to be its own prison. Emily threw herself into transformation as if becoming a better person could somehow balance the cosmic scales. She finished college with perfect grades, found work at Chen & Associates, and dedicated herself to being useful, helpful, indispensable. She volunteered at homeless shelters, donated generously to victim advocacy groups, and lived a life of almost monastic dedication to doing good. But no amount of good deeds could erase the fundamental truth that she was a fraud, a criminal, masquerading as a respectable member of society. Sarah Chen, the firm's senior partner, had become something of a mentor over the years. A brilliant woman in her mid-30s who had built the practice from nothing, Sarah appreciated Emily's dedication and had gradually expanded her responsibilities beyond the typical receptionist role. Emily coordinated the firm's pro bono work, managed complex scheduling from multiple attorneys, and had even assisted with research on several cases. Sarah often remarked that Emily had the instincts of a lawyer, that she should consider law school. If only she knew, Emily would think during these conversations, that her most valuable employee was the kind of person the firm existed to prosecute. The routine of her days had become a kind of meditation, each familiar task a reminder that she was still here, still useful, still managing to build something meaningful from the wreckage of that November night. Answering phones, greeting clients, organizing files, these simple acts felt like penance, and penance felt like progress. But today felt different from the moment Emily unlocked the office doors. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that change was coming whether she was ready for it or not. She tried to shake off the feeling as she went through her morning routine, but it clung to her like humidity, making her skin feel too tight and her breath too shallow. The first client of the day was Mrs. Patterson, seeking help with her son's custody case. Emily greeted her with practiced warmth, offered coffee, and ensured she was comfortable in the waiting area. Normal, routine, safe. The second client was Mr. Jameson, consulting about a workplace discrimination case. Again, Emily's professionalism transformed anxiety into confidence. This is what she did, who she was, the person who made difficult days bearable for people facing the worst moments of their lives. It was just before 10 o'clock when everything changed.
The man who walked through the glass doors of Chen and Associates that morning moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to being in control. David Mitchell, according to the appointment book, though something about the way he carried himself suggested that names were negotiable things in his world. He was perhaps 42, with graying temples and the kind of sharp suit that spoke of either success or a very good understanding of how to project it. Emily looked up from her computer screen with her standard welcoming smile, but it faltered slightly when their eyes met. David Mitchell's gaze held hers a moment too long, with an intensity that made her stomach clench. Most clients were nervous when they arrived, uncertain about legal proceedings and grateful for her reassuring presence. This man studied her with the calculating focus of someone taking inventory. "Good morning," Emily said, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. "You must be Mr. Mitchell. I'm Emily Rodriguez, and I'll be handling your check-in today. Mr. Chen is expecting you at 10:15. "Actually," David said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place, "I was hoping to speak with Sarah Chen specifically. I have a rather sensitive matter to discuss." He paused, letting his eyes wander over her face in a way that felt invasive. "A hit-and-run case, very personal to me." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Hit-and-run cases weren't uncommon at the firm. Sarah handled several each year, representing both victims and occasionally defendants. There was no reason for Emily to feel the sudden spike of adrenaline that made her fingers tremble against the keyboard. "Of course," Emily said, grateful that her voice remained steady. "Sarah specializes in personal injury cases. Can you tell me a bit more about the nature of your case so I can prepare her properly?" David's smile was sharp-edged, more predatory than friendly. 5 years ago, my younger brother was struck by a drunk driver on Ashland Avenue. The driver fled the scene. Robert, my brother, survived, but he'll never be the same. He's in a wheelchair now, requires constant care. The hit-and-run driver was never caught. Emily felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. Ashland Avenue, 5 years ago. The specificity of the details made her skin feel electric with panic, but she couldn't let it show. Couldn't let this stranger see that his words had just rearranged her entire understanding of her place in the world. "I'm so sorry to hear about your brother," she managed, and was surprised to find that the sympathy was genuine despite her terror. "That must have been incredibly difficult for your family." "You have no idea," David said,
and there was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning Emily wasn't sure she wanted to understand. "But I've spent 5 years looking for the person who destroyed Robert's life, and I think I'm finally close to finding them." Emily's hands had started to shake, so she clasped them together in her lap, where David couldn't see them. "I hope Sarah can help you find the justice your brother deserves. She's very good at what she does." "Oh, I'm counting on it," David said. "Justice is exactly what I'm after." The way he said the word justice made Emily's blood run cold. There was a weight to it, a finality that suggested David's version of justice might not be the kind that happened in courtrooms. She busied herself with paperwork, desperate for something to do with her hands, some way to appear normal while her world collapsed around her. "Sarah should be back from her meeting in about 10 minutes. Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" "That's very kind of you. You know, you remind me of someone. Have we met before?" The question hung in the air like a trap, waiting to be sprung. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she fought to keep her expression neutral. "I don't think so. I have one of those faces, though. People tell me that all the time." David said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Maybe it will come to me." Emily excused herself to get his coffee, grateful for the chance to escape his scrutiny even briefly. In the small kitchen area behind the reception desk, she gripped the counter and forced herself to breathe. This could be a coincidence. Hit-and-run accidents happened frequently in Chicago. The location and timing could be random. David Mitchell might genuinely be here seeking legal representation for his brother, with no knowledge of who she was or what she had done. But even as she tried to convince herself of these possibilities, Emily knew in her bones that her past had finally caught up with her. The way David looked at her, the specific details he'd mentioned, the predatory smile, everything about his presence suggested that her 5 years of careful anonymity were over. When she returned with his coffee, David was examining a framed photo on the side table, the firm staff photo from last year's holiday party. Emily was in the back row, smiling brightly alongside the attorneys and paralegals. "Nice photo," he said, accepting the coffee without looking away from her face. "You look happy here, like someone who's found their place in the world." "I've been here for 3 years. It's a good firm. Sarah and her team do important work." "Important work," David repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose helping people find justice is about as important as it gets. Don't you think so, Emily?" The way he said her name made her blood run cold. There was too much familiarity in it, too much suggestion that he knew more about her than a stranger should. Emily retreated behind her desk, putting the solid barrier of mahogany between them, though it felt inadequate against whatever David Mitchell was bringing into her carefully ordered world. "Sarah should be back any moment," she said, glancing at her computer screen as if checking the schedule rather than avoiding his gaze. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to tell her about your case before she arrives?" "Actually, yes," David said, leaning forward slightly. "Tell her that I have new evidence, very compelling evidence, the kind that could break a case wide open." Emily's mouth dried. "What kind of evidence?" David's smile widened, and Emily realized with growing horror that he was enjoying this. Whatever game he was playing, her obvious discomfort was exactly the response he had been hoping for. "Security footage," he said quietly. "Grainy, but clear enough. And witness statements. Amazing what people remember when you know how to ask the right questions." Emily felt the room spin slightly, her vision narrowing to the point where David's face seemed to exist in a tunnel of darkness. Security footage. After 5 years, could such a thing still exist? And witnesses? Had someone seen her that night without her knowing it? "That sounds very promising for your case," she said, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. "I'm sure Sarah will be very interested to hear about it." "Oh, she will be," David agreed. "But first, I was hoping you and I could have a little chat, privately, about the night of November 15th, 5 years ago." The date hit Emily like a sledgehammer to the chest. November 15th. The exact date of the accident, spoken with casual precision that left no room for doubt. David Mitchell knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. "I'm not sure what you mean," Emily said, but her voice cracked on the words, betraying her. David stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Emily, and I think it's time we talked about what you're going to do to make this right."
Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, some instinct telling her to call for help, to alert Sarah, to do something other than sit there while her worst nightmare materialized in the form of David Mitchell's knowing smile. But David raised his hand in a gesture that was somehow both casual and threatening. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said quietly. "We're having such a nice conversation, it would be a shame to interrupt it." "I don't know what you think you know," Emily said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "But I think there's been some kind of mistake." David laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, there's been a mistake, all right. A 5-year-old mistake that's been eating away at you every single day since it happened. I can see it in your eyes, Emily. The guilt, the fear, the constant waiting for this moment." Emily felt tears threaten, but she fought them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Not yet. "What do you want from me?" "Now that's a better question," David said, settling back into his chair as if they were discussing the weather. "What I want is very simple. I want justice for my brother. Robert's medical bills have bankrupted our family. He requires round-the-clock care, specialized equipment, therapy that will continue for the rest of his life. The person who hit him and drove away like he was nothing more than roadkill, that person owes us." "And you think that person is me," Emily said, surprised by how steady her voice had become. Terror had a way of clarifying things, she realized. When the worst possible thing was happening, there was a strange comfort in no longer having to pretend it might not happen. "I don't think it, Emily. I know it." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Would you like to see the evidence?" Emily stared at the folder as if it contained a live snake. Part of her wanted to maintain the pretense, to keep denying everything until David gave up and left. But another part, the part that had been carrying this secret like a stone in her chest for 5 years, was almost relieved that the waiting was finally over. "Show me," she said. David opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. The first was a grainy security camera image showing a Honda Civic stopped at a red light. The license plate was partially obscured, but Emily could make out enough numbers to recognize her old car. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. on November 15th, just minutes before the accident. "This is from a traffic camera 2 blocks from the scene," David said conversationally. "Poor quality, but enough to identify the vehicle. It took me 3 years to track down this footage." The second photograph was worse. It showed Emily's car again, this time clearly speeding through what was obviously a red light. The image was blurry, but Emily could see her own silhouette behind the wheel, could see the moment captured just before her life changed forever. "And this," David continued, "is from a security camera outside a convenience store. You ran that red light doing at least 50 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Drunk, scared, completely reckless." Emily closed her eyes, but that only made the images more vivid. She could remember that night with perfect clarity now. The rain on the windshield, the yellow light that she'd convinced herself she could make. The sickening moment when she realized she wasn't going to stop in time. "The final piece," David said, producing a third photograph, came from a witness who was walking her dog that night. "She saw the whole thing. Saw you get out of the car, look at my brother lying in the street, and then get back in and drive away." Emily opened her eyes and found herself looking at a photo that showed her crouched next to a figure on the ground. She remembered that moment too. The terrible few seconds when she'd convinced herself she might be able to help before panic took over and she fled. Mrs. Kowalski is 83 now, but her memory of that night is crystal clear. She even remembered part of your license plate number. Took me 2 more years to track down all the Honda Civics registered in the city that matched her description. "Why didn't she call the police that night?" Emily asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. "She tried," David said, "but she doesn't speak English very well, and the dispatcher couldn't understand her. By the time they sent someone to check, you were long gone and my brother was in surgery,
fighting for his life. Emily felt sick. All these years she had convinced herself that maybe no one had seen what happened, that perhaps she could live with her secret forever. The knowledge that an elderly woman had tried to help and been ignored made her guilt exponentially worse. "So what happens now?" she asked. David leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual to predatory. "Now we discuss what my silence is worth to you." Emily's stomach dropped. "You want money?" "Robert's care costs $40,000 a year. He'll need that care for the rest of his life. He's 37 years old, so let's say 40 more years of expenses. That's $1.6 million, plus punitive damages for the pain and suffering you've caused our entire family. Let's round it up to $2 million. Emily almost laughed. The number was so absurd. "I'm a receptionist. I don't have $2 million. I don't have $20,000. "Then you'd better figure something out," David said, his voice hardening. "Or the alternative is that I walk out of here and go straight to the police with this evidence. You'll be arrested for vehicular assault, hit and run, driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. Even with a good lawyer, you're looking at 10 to 15 years in prison." Emily's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. She could try to run, but where would she go? David clearly had resources and determination. If he'd spent 5 years tracking her down, he wouldn't give up easily. She could confess everything to Sarah and hope for legal protection, but what could Sarah do against photographic evidence and witness testimony? "I need time to think," Emily said. "You have until tomorrow morning," David replied, standing up. "I'll be back here at 9 o'clock. If you don't have a plan to get me my money, I'll be making some phone calls. And if I do manage to come up with it somehow, how do I know you won't just ask for more later?" David smiled that predatory smile again. "You don't. That's the beauty of this arrangement, Emily. You'll never know when I might need more money for Robert's care, or when I might decide that justice requires something more than cash." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What does that mean?" "It means that for the rest of your life, you'll belong to me," David said quietly. "Every decision you make, every breath you take, every moment of happiness you think you deserve, all of it exists at my discretion, because I am the only thing standing between you and the consequences of what you did." With that, David Mitchell walked out of the office, leaving Emily alone with the photographs and the terrible weight of her collapsing world. She stared at the images of her younger self, at the evidence of the choice that had defined her adult life, and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, overwhelming and nauseating, but underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. The waiting was over. The secret was out, and for the first time in 5 years, Emily Rodriguez was going to have to decide who she really was.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Emily sat alone in the lobby for nearly an hour after David Mitchell left, staring at the photographs he had abandoned on her desk like evidence at a crime scene. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows seemed too bright, too cheerful for the darkness that had just invaded her carefully constructed world. Clients came and went, offering polite greetings that she returned automatically while her mind turned through impossible scenarios. $2 million. The number felt abstract, like something from a movie, rather than a real demand being made of her actual life. Her salary at Chen & Associates was comfortable but modest, $60,000 a year, which had seemed like a fortune when Sarah first hired her, that now revealed itself to be laughably inadequate. Even if she worked for 30 years without spending a penny on food, rent, or basic survival, she couldn't accumulate the kind of money David was demanding. The photographs drew her attention again and again, each glance revealing new details that made her stomach clench. The timestamp on the traffic camera image, 11:47 p.m., meant she'd lied to the police officer who'd eventually questioned students at the bar. She'd claimed to have left at 11:30, walking home alone and seeing nothing unusual. Such a small lie in service of a much larger one, but lies had a way of compounding, of creating their own gravity until truth became impossible to escape. Sarah returned from her client meeting just after noon, her usual energetic stride faltering slightly when she noticed Emily's pallor. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked, dropping her briefcase beside Emily's desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony wasn't lost on Emily. She had seen a ghost, in a way. But what was it? She couldn't quite put it into words.
the ghost of her past, materializing in the form of David Mitchell's predatory smile. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Just a headache. How did your meeting go?" Sarah launched into a detailed account of her morning with the difficult client, but Emily found it impossible to focus on the familiar rhythms of office conversation. Every word seemed to come from a great distance, filtered through the constant noise of panic that had taken up residence in her skull. She nodded at appropriate intervals and made the right sounds, but her attention kept drifting to the manila folder David had left behind. "Emily," Sarah said sharply, and Emily realized she'd been asked a question. "I said, did Mr. Mitchell reschedule his appointment? He never showed up." Emily's mouth drew dry. She'd been so consumed by the confrontation that she'd forgotten David was supposed to meet with Sarah. He had a family emergency," she said, the lies sliding out with practiced ease. "I rescheduled him for tomorrow morning." "That's odd. When I spoke to him yesterday, he said this case was extremely urgent. Family emergency or not, most clients don't just walk away from something they've described as a matter of life and death." "Maybe he'll explain more when he comes in tomorrow," Emily said, hoping her voice didn't betray the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks performed by muscle memory, while Emily's conscious mind remained trapped in an endless loop of panic and calculation. She found herself researching criminal defense attorneys, bankruptcy procedures, and even international banking laws as if the internet might contain some magical solution to her impossible situation. But every search led to the same conclusion. She was trapped, with no legal escape from David Mitchell's demands. At 6 o'clock, Sarah began gathering her things to leave for the day. "Are you sure you're feeling all right?" she asked again, concern evident in her voice. "You seem distracted all afternoon. If you need to take tomorrow off—" "No," Emily said quickly. "I'll be fine, just tired." Sarah hesitated at the door. "Emily, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's wrong, if you need help." For a moment, Emily was tempted to confess everything. Sarah was brilliant, compassionate, and had more experience with criminal law than anyone Emily knew. If there was a way out of this nightmare, Sarah would be able to find it. But the photographs on Emily's desk served as a constant reminder that some problems couldn't be solved with legal expertise and good intentions. "I appreciate that, but everything's fine, really." After Sarah left, Emily locked the office doors and returned to her desk, spreading David's evidence out in front of her like a puzzle she might somehow solve through careful examination. The security camera images were damning, but not perfect. The license plate was partially obscured, her face wasn't clearly visible, and the timestamps could potentially be disputed. The witness statement from Mrs. Kowalski was more problematic, especially if the elderly woman could identify Emily in a lineup. But as Emily studied the photographs, something began to bother her. The third image, the one showing her crouched next to the victim, seemed wrong somehow. She remembered that moment vividly, the rain, the darkness, the terrible weight of realization as she understood what she'd done. But in her memory, she'd barely stopped the car. Had spent perhaps 30 seconds looking at the injured man before panic overwhelmed her and she fled. The photograph showed her in much more detail than seemed possible for such a brief encounter. She was clearly visible, despite the rain and darkness, her face turned to a security camera that should have been too far away to capture such clear detail. And something about her posture seemed off, as if she'd been crouched there for much longer than the few seconds she remembered. Emily pulled out her phone and began searching for information about security cameras and image quality in 2019. What she found made her stomach drop even further. The level of detail in David's photographs would have required professional-grade equipment, the kind typically found only in high-end commercial districts. The intersection where the accident occurred was primarily residential with a few small businesses that would have had basic security systems at best. A terrible possibility began to form in her mind. She thought about David Mitchell's predatory smile, his obvious enjoyment of her fear, the way he'd seemed to savor every moment of her growing panic. What if this wasn't about justice for his brother at all? What if David Mitchell was something else entirely? Emily spent the next hour conducting increasingly frantic searches, looking for any mention of David Mitchell, hit-and-run accidents on Ashland Avenue, or victims named Robert Mitchell. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, made her blood cold run. There was no record of a hit-and-run accident on Ashland Avenue 5 years ago involving a victim named Robert Mitchell. No police reports, no news articles, no hospital records that she could access. It was as if the accident David had described in such vivid detail had never happened. But Emily knew it had happened. She remembered every detail of that November night, from the rain on her windshield to the sickening sound of impact. Someone had been hurt, possibly killed, because of her reckless decision to drive while intoxicated. The guilt that had consumed her for 5 years was based on real actions with real consequences. So who was David Mitchell, and what did he really want? Emily was still staring at her computer screen when she heard the soft click of the front door opening. She looked up, expecting to see the cleaning crew arriving for their evening shift, but instead found David Mitchell standing in the darkened lobby, his silhouette backlit by the streetlights. "You're working late," he said, his voice carrying easily across the empty space. "I admire dedication." Emily moved her hand instinctively toward the phone, but David raised his finger in that same casual warning gesture he had used that morning. "I told you not to do that, Emily. We wouldn't want to complicate things unnecessarily." "The building is locked," Emily said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "How did you get in?" David smiled, that predatory smile, and held up a keycard. "Amazing what you can accomplish with the right resources. And I have very good resources." Emily stood slowly, every instinct screaming her to run, but there was nowhere to go. David was in between her and the front entrance, and the emergency exits were all alarmed. She was trapped in her own workplace with a man who was becoming more dangerous by the hour. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I may have been too generous with the timeline. Justice delayed is justice denied, after all. I told you I don't have that kind of money. It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible, Emily. You just need the right motivation." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a second folder. "I thought you might need some additional incentive to find a solution." Emily stared at the folder, knowing that whatever it contained would make her situation even worse. "What is that?" "More evidence," David said simply. "About the accident, about your brother Robert, about you." "There is no Robert," Emily said quietly. David's smile widened, and Emily realized with growing horror that she'd just walked into another trap. "Very good, Emily. I was wondering when you'd figure that out."
David Mitchell's smile transformed from predatory to genuinely pleased, like a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Emily. Most people never think to verify the story. They're too consumed by their own guilt to question whether they're being told the truth." Emily felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "There was no accident on Ashland Avenue? No victim named Robert Mitchell?" "Oh, there was definitely an accident," David corrected, settling into the chair across from her desk with the casual air of someone making a social call. "And there was definitely a victim. You remember it perfectly. The rain, the impact, the man lying in the street. All of that happened exactly as you remember it." "Then who are you?" Emily asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. David's smile widened further. "I'm Robert Mitchell, Emily, the man you hit with your car 5 years ago, the victim you left for dead in the middle of Ashland Avenue." Emily stared at him, her mind struggling to process this revelation. The man sitting across from her showed no signs of the devastating injuries David had described earlier. He moved with fluid grace, showed no evidence of chronic pain or disability, appeared to be in excellent health. "That's impossible. You said Robert was paralyzed, that he needed constant care." "I lied," Robert said, simply. "About a lot of things, actually. I'm not paralyzed. I don't have a brother named David, and I'm not here seeking justice for an innocent victim." Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank back into her chair. "Then what do you want?" Robert leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "What I want, Emily, is for you to understand what you did to me that night. Not just the physical damage, though there was plenty of that, but the complete destruction of my life." "I don't understand," Emily said, though part of her was beginning to. 5 years ago, I wasn't just some random pedestrian. I was Dr. Robert Mitchell, a cardiac surgeon at Northwestern Memorial. I had a reputation, a career, a life that mattered. And then you came along, drunk and reckless, and destroyed all of it in a matter of seconds. Emily felt sick. A doctor. She'd hit a doctor and left him to die in the street. "But you're fine now. You're obviously recovered." "Fine? You call this fine?"
He stood and began pacing around her desk like a predator circling wounded prey. Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up in a hospital bed with no memory of how you got there? To spend months in physical therapy learning to walk again? To discover that the career you spent 15 years building is over because your hands shake too badly to perform surgery? Emily watched him pace, noting the slight limp she hadn't noticed before, the way he favored his left side. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it. "Sorry?" Robert stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Do you know what happened to me after you drove away? I lay on that street for 40 minutes before someone found me. 40 minutes of internal bleeding while you went home and pretended nothing had happened." "I was scared," Emily said, knowing how inadequate the words sounded. "You were scared," Robert repeated mockingly. "Well, let me tell you what scared looks like, Emily. Scared is waking up from a coma and being told that your spleen had to be removed. Scared is discovering that nerve damage in your hands means you'll never perform surgery again. Scared is losing your medical license, your income, your identity, everything that made you who you were." Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but Robert showed no sympathy. "I lost my job, my career, my purpose. The medical review board decided that someone who couldn't account for how they ended up unconscious in the street wasn't fit to practice medicine. The hospital settled my disability claim for a fraction of what my career was worth, and I spent 3 years drinking myself to death in a studio apartment." "But you survived," Emily said desperately. "You got better. You're here now." "I survived, but I didn't get better. I got angry. And I got very, very good at finding people who think they can escape the consequences of their actions." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. "What do you mean?" Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a different folder, this one much thicker than the previous ones. "You're not my first case, Emily. Over the past 2 years, I've tracked down 17 hit-and-run drivers who were never caught. 17 people who thought they could destroy lives and walk away without consequences." Emily stared at the folder with growing horror. "What did you do to them?" "I gave them a choice," Robert said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "The same choice I'm giving you. They could pay for the damage they caused, or they could face the consequences of their actions. Most of them chose to pay."
"And the ones who didn't?" Robert's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Let's just say that hit-and-run drivers don't tend to have very good luck with automobiles. Accidents happen so easily when you're distracted by guilt and fear." Emily felt her blood turn to ice. "You killed them." "I gave them justice," Robert corrected. "The same justice they gave their victims. Some of them learned to live with the consequences of their choices. Others didn't." Emily's mind raced through the implications. Robert wasn't just a victim seeking compensation. He was a serial killer, targeting hit-and-run drivers with the methodical precision of someone who turned revenge into an art form. And somehow, after 5 years, he had found her. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Very carefully," Robert said. "It took me 3 years to track down the security footage, another year to identify your car, and 6 months to locate you. Amazing how much information is available if you know where to look and have enough motivation." "But there was no police report," Emily said, grasping for some inconsistency in his story. "No record of the accident." Robert nodded approvingly. "Very good. You're absolutely right. There was no official report. When I woke up in the hospital, I told them I couldn't remember what happened. I was protecting you, Emily, though I didn't realize it at the time." "Why would you do that?" "Because I was a doctor," Robert said simply. "I believed in helping people, in giving them second chances. I thought whoever hit me was probably just scared, that they would come forward eventually and make things right. I waited for months, Emily, months of hoping that you would develop a conscience and take responsibility for what you had done. Emily felt the weight of that revelation settle on her chest like a stone. Robert had protected her, had given her the chance to do the right thing, and she had used it against him, building a life on the foundation of his undeserved mercy. "When you never came forward," Robert continued, "I realized I had been naive. People like you don't develop consciences, Emily. You just get better at hiding your crimes." "So you decided to become a criminal yourself?" Emily said, surprising herself with the accusation. Robert's expression darkened. "I decided to become justice. The system failed both of us that night. It failed to catch you, and it failed to protect me from the consequences of your actions. So I created my own system." Emily stood up slowly, her hands shaking, but her voice growing stronger. "You're not justice, Robert. You're just another criminal. You've murdered people." "I've balanced the scales," Robert replied calmly. "Every person I've dealt with was guilty of destroying innocent lives. They made their choices, Emily, just like you made yours." "And what about your choice?" Emily demanded, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "You chose to become a killer. You chose to hunt people down like animals. How is that any different than what I did?" For the first time since he'd revealed his identity, Robert looked genuinely angry. "What you did was senseless destruction caused by selfishness and cowardice. What I do serves a purpose. I make sure that people like you face consequences for their actions." "By murdering them," Emily said flatly. "By giving them exactly what they gave their victims, an unexpected encounter with mortality. Some survive, some don't, just like their victims." Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a transformation from terror to disgust to something approaching fury. This man had spent 2 years positioning himself as an agent of justice, but he was nothing more than a serial killer with a self-serving rationalization for his crimes. "You're insane," she said quietly. Robert's smile returned, but this time it looked forced. "I'm practical, Emily, and I'm giving you the same choice I gave all the others. $2 million, or you join the statistics." "I don't have $2 million, Emily said, but her voice had changed. The desperation was gone, replaced by something harder. "I'm not going to pay you," she repeated, taking a step toward him. "And I'm not going to let you leave here tonight." Robert laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "Emily, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. I'm the one with the evidence. I'm the one in control." "No," Emily said, reaching for her phone. "You're the one who just confessed to being a serial killer."
Robert moved faster than Emily expected, lunging across her desk and knocking the phone from her hand before she could dial. The device clattered across the marble floor, its screen cracking against the wall with a sound like breaking bones. Emily stumbled backward, her hip striking the edge of a filing cabinet hard enough to make her gasp. "That was a mistake, Emily," Robert said, his casual demeanor evaporating completely. "A very serious mistake." Emily pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same terrifying conclusion. The office was empty, the building locked, and she was alone with a man who had just admitted to murdering multiple people. Her broken phone lay useless across the room, and even if she could reach it, Robert would stop her long before she could summon help. "You were supposed to be easy," Robert continued, advancing on her with predatory patience. "Guilty, terrified, desperate to avoid consequences, just like all the others. But you had to be difficult." "The others fought back too, didn't they?" Emily said, trying to keep him talking while she searched for anything that might serve as a weapon. "That's how you really decide who lives and who dies. It's not about justice at all." Robert's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering her words seriously. Some of them accepted responsibility for their actions. They understood that payment was required, and they found ways to provide it.
Those people are still alive, Emily, living with the knowledge that their debt has been paid. And the ones who refuse to pay? The ones who refused to pay had already demonstrated their true nature. Selfish, reckless, unwilling to accept consequences. The world is better off without them. Emily felt behind her for something, anything that might help her survive the next few minutes. Her fingers found the handle of a letter opener in the filing cabinet's top drawer, and she palmed it carefully while keeping her eyes on Robert's face. "What about you, Robert? What kind of consequences have you accepted for your actions?" Robert paused in his advance, clearly not expecting the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've spent 2 years murdering people and calling it justice. But you haven't faced any consequences at all, have you? You just keep killing and telling yourself it's righteous." "I'm not the criminal here, Emily," Robert said, but there was something defensive in his tone now. "You're not?" Emily laughed, surprising herself how bitter it sounded. "You've committed at least 17 murders. You've threatened me, broken into my workplace, and terrorized me for hours. But somehow you think you're the victim in this situation?" Robert's face flushed with anger. "I lost everything because of what you did. My career, my life, my future, all of it destroyed because you were too selfish and cowardly to take responsibility." "So you became a killer?" Emily said flatly. "That was your choice, Robert, not mine. You could have rebuilt your life, found a new purpose, become someone better than you were before. Instead, you chose to become a monster." "I chose justice," Robert shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "You chose revenge," Emily corrected, gripping the letter opener tighter behind her back. "And now you're going to face the consequences of that choice." Robert's eyes narrowed, and Emily realized she'd pushed him too far. Whatever restraint had been holding him back was gone now, replaced by the cold fury of someone who had convinced himself that murder was morally justifiable. "You want to know about consequences, Emily?" Robert said, reaching into his jacket. "Let me show you what consequences look like." Emily saw the glint of metal and knew she was out of time. As Robert pulled what looked like a knife from his jacket, Emily lunged forward with the letter opener, aiming for his wrist. The blade was small and dull, more suitable for opening envelopes than defending against a killer, but it was all she had. Robert jerked back, the letter opener catching him across the back of his hand instead of his wrist. He cursed and dropped his knife, blood welling from the shallow cut Emily had managed to inflict. She tried to press her advantage, but Robert was stronger and faster than her, grabbing her wrist and twisting until she dropped her makeshift weapon. They grappled in the narrow space between her desk and the filing cabinet, Emily fighting with desperate fury while Robert tried to subdue her without making too much noise. She managed to drive her knee into his injured side, and he doubled over with a grunt of pain that gave her a moment to break free. Emily ran toward the conference room, remembering that it had a phone and hoping she could lock herself inside long enough to call for help. But Robert recovered quickly, tackling her just as she reached the doorway. They crashed through the entrance together, Emily's head striking the conference table hard enough to make her vision blur. "Enough," Robert shouted, pinning her to the floor with his weight. "This is over, Emily. You made your choice." Emily struggled under him, but her strength was fading and her vision kept swimming in and out of focus. She could feel consciousness slipping away and knew that if she passed out now, she would never wake up. "Wait," she gasped, forcing the words out despite the pressure on her chest. "Wait, I want to tell you something." Robert paused, his hands around her throat, but not yet applying fatal pressure. "What?" "The man you hit," Emily said, each word an effort. "The night of the accident. I know who he really was." Robert's grip loosened slightly. "What are you talking about?" "I recognized him," Emily lied, hoping desperation would make her convincing.
From the news. He was wanted for armed robbery. 3 banks in 6 months. The police had been hunting him for weeks. Robert's hands went slack around her throat. That's impossible. Emily sucked in a desperate breath and kept talking. You can look it up. Marcus Webb arrested 2 days after the accident while recovering in Northwestern Memorial. The police found him because of the hospital admission records. It was a complete fabrication, but Emily could see doubt creeping into Robert's expression. She pressed her advantage, knowing this might be her only chance. You didn't lose your career because I hit you, Robert. You lost it because you helped the police catch a dangerous criminal. You were a hero, and you never even knew it. Robert sat back on his heels, his expression shifting from rage to confusion. No, that's not... I would have remembered. You had a head injury. Memory loss is common with that kind of trauma. But the police reports are all there, Robert. Public record, you can verify everything I'm telling you. Emily watched Robert's face as her lies took root, saw 5 years of carefully constructed justification beginning to crumble. He had built his entire identity around being a victim of senseless violence. But if his accident had actually resulted in the capture of a dangerous criminal, then everything he believed about that night was wrong. Even if that's true, Robert said slowly, it doesn't change what you did. You still hit me. You still drove away. You're right, Emily said simply, and I've regretted it every day for 5 years. I was young, scared, and stupid, and I made a terrible choice that I can never take back. But Robert, you've spent 2 years making terrible choices too. We're both guilty here. Robert stared at her for a long moment, and Emily could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The man who had been a doctor, who had dedicated his life to helping people, was struggling against the monster he had allowed himself to become. I can't take back what I've done, Emily continued quietly, but you still can. You can stop us before you become something you can't live with. Robert's shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked older, smaller, like the weight of his actions was finally crushing him. I've already become something I can't live with.
The conference room fell silent except for the sound of their labored breathing. Robert sat on the floor beside Emily, no longer the predatory killer who had terrorized her for hours, but a broken man confronting the magnitude of what he had become. Emily remained perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever spell her desperate lies had cast. 17 people, Robert said finally, his voice hollow with something that might have been dawning horror. 17 people, I convinced myself, deserved to die. Emily felt a chill as the full reality of Robert's confession settled over her. She was sitting next to a serial killer who had just admitted to 17 murders, and her fabricated story about Marcus Webb was the only thing keeping her alive. If Robert discovered her lies, if he looked up the police records and found no mention of any armed robber named Marcus Webb, her desperate gambit would collapse. Not all of them died, Emily said carefully, hoping to maintain the fiction while learning more about Robert's crimes. You said some of them chose to pay. Robert nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on something Emily couldn't see. 6 of them. 6 people who found ways to compensate their victims' families. They understood that accountability meant more than just admitting guilt. What happened to the others? Robert's expression grew distant, and Emily realized she was seeing him relive each crime in vivid detail. The first one was in Detroit, a businessman who had killed a teenager in a crosswalk and never stopped. He laughed when I confronted him, said the kid should have been more careful. His car went off a bridge 3 days later. Emily felt sick, but she forced herself to keep listening. Understanding Robert's methodology might be the key to surviving this encounter. The second was a woman in Milwaukee. She had crippled an elderly man and fled the scene. When I found her, she offered me money to disappear. Not compensation for her victim, just a bribe to leave her alone. She died in what appeared to be a hit-and-run accident. Poetic justice, I thought at the time. And you never felt guilty about what you were doing?
Robert looked at her with something that might have been surprise. Guilty? Emily, these people were monsters. They had destroyed innocent lives and walked away without consequences. I was balancing the scales of justice. But you were murdering people, Emily said quietly. No matter how you justified it to yourself, you were still taking lives. I was taking the lives of people who had already proven they had no regard for human life. They made their choices, Emily, just like you made yours. Emily saw her opening and pressed forward carefully. But what if my choice that night actually saved lives? What if hitting you prevented Marcus Webb from robbing more banks, maybe killing innocent people? Robert flinched as if she'd struck him. Don't try to make yourself into a hero, Emily. What you did was still wrong. I'm not trying to make myself into a hero. I'm trying to make you see that actions have consequences we never anticipate. My terrible choice might have led to something good. Your quest for justice might have prevented 17 people from finding redemption. Redemption? Robert's voice was sharp with disbelief. These people had 5 years to find redemption, Emily. 5 years to come forward, to take responsibility, to make amends. None of them did. Because they were scared, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. Just like I was scared. Just like you're scared right now. Robert stared at her, and Emily could see something shifting in his expression. The righteous anger that had sustained him for 2 years was cracking, letting doubt seep in like water through a failing dam. I'm not scared, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, you are, Emily said gently. You're terrified of facing the truth about what you've become. You've spent so long convincing yourself that you were serving justice that you can't admit that you became the very thing you are hunting. Robert's hands began to shake, and Emily realized she was witnessing the psychological collapse of a man who had built his entire identity around a lie. Everything he had told himself about being an agent of justice, about balancing cosmic scales, was crumbling in the face of Emily's relentless logic. I was a doctor, he whispered, and his voice sounded like that of a lost child. I took an oath to do no harm. I saved lives, Emily. I helped people. You can help people again, Emily said, leaning forward slightly. But first, you have to stop hurting them. Robert looked at her with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time since he'd walked into the office that morning. How many families did I destroy? How many people are mourning victims who died because of my quest for justice? Emily felt a moment of genuine sympathy for the broken man sitting beside her. Whatever Robert had been before the accident, whatever good he might have done as a doctor, had been twisted into something monstrous by pain and rage and the seductive appeal of righteous vengeance. That's not what matters now, she said quietly. What matters is what you choose to do next. Robert was quiet for so long that Emily began to worry he was retreating back into his killer persona. But when he finally spoke, his voice was that of Dr. Robert Mitchell, rather than the predator who had terrorized her for hours. I need to confess. I need to tell the police everything I've done. Emily felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. That's the right choice, Robert. But first, Robert said, reaching into his jacket, I need to give you something. Emily tensed, afraid he was reaching for another weapon, but instead Robert pulled out a thick manila envelope. These are the real police reports from the night of the accident, the truth about what happened to me and what happened to the man you actually hit.
Emily opened the envelope with trembling fingers, afraid of what she might find, but knowing she needed to see the truth after 5 years of guilt and uncertainty. The first document was a police report dated November 16th, 5 years ago, the day after the accident. As she read, Emily's understanding of that night shifted completely. The man she had struck wasn't Marcus Webb or any other criminal. He was Thomas Chen, a 43-year-old construction worker who had been walking home from a late shift. He had survived the accident with minor injuries, a broken arm and some bruises, and had been released from the hospital the same day. But there was more. Thomas Chen had told police he had been drinking heavily before the accident and had stumbled into traffic without looking. He had explicitly told officers that he didn't blame the driver who hit him, that the accident was his own fault for being careless and intoxicated. He forgave you, Robert said quietly, watching Emily's face as she read. The man you hit forgave you before you even knew you needed forgiveness. Emily continued reading through the reports, learned that Thomas Chen had actually tried to prevent police from investigating the accident. He had insisted that no charges should be filed against the driver who hit him, that it was just an unfortunate accident caused by his own poor judgment. Thomas Chen died 2 years ago, Robert said. Lung cancer. He never knew that the driver who hit him had spent 5 years drowning in guilt over an accident he'd already forgiven. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in 5 years, they weren't tears of guilt and shame. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of profound sorrow for the forgiveness she had been too afraid to seek. I lied about everything else, Robert continued. My injuries, my lost career, my brother David, all of it was fiction designed to make you suffer. But the forgiveness was real, Emily. Thomas Chen forgave you. And maybe it's time you forgave yourself. Emily looked up at Robert through her tears and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. The monster who had terrorized her was gone, replaced by a damaged man who was finally confronting the magnitude of his crimes. What happens now? She asked. Robert stood up slowly, his movements those of someone much older than his actual years. Now, I call the police and confess to 17 murders. Now, I spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for the families I destroyed. And now, you get to live with the knowledge that you were forgiven long before you ever asked for it. Emily watched as Robert pulled out his phone and dialed 911, listening as he calmly informed the dispatcher that he needed to confess to multiple homicides. There was something peaceful in his voice, the relief of someone who had finally stopped running from the truth about himself. As they waited for the police to arrive, Emily Rodriguez and Dr. Robert Mitchell sat silently in the conference room with their final confrontation played out. Two people who had been shaped by a single moment of violence 5 years ago, both of them transformed in ways they never could have imagined. I'm sorry, Robert said finally, for everything I did to you tonight, for the fear, the threats, the lies. You didn't deserve any of that. You were in pain, Emily replied. Pain makes people do terrible things. Pain is an explanation, but it's not an excuse. I chose to become a killer, Emily. That wasn't the accident's fault or your fault or anyone's fault but mine. Emily nodded, understanding for the first time the difference between reasons and justifications, between explaining behavior and excusing it. She had spent 5 years using her guilt and fear as excuses for not seeking the truth about that November night. Robert had spent 2 years using his pain as justification for murder. Both of them had been trapped by their own inability to face reality. But tonight, finally, they had found their way back to truth. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found Emily Rodriguez and Dr. Robert Mitchell sitting quietly in the conference room of Chen and Associates, waiting to tell them a story about justice, forgiveness, and the terrible price of living in denial. It would take months to unravel all of Robert's crimes, to contact the families of his victims, to begin the long process of accountability and healing. But for Emily, the healing had already begun. After 5 years of carrying a burden that had never truly been hers to bear, she was finally free to discover who she could become when she stopped running from who she had been. 3 months later, Emily Rodriguez stood in the same conference room where her life had changed forever, but this time she wasn't alone. Thomas Chen's widow, Maria, sat across from her holding the hands of her teenage daughter as Emily told them about the night 5 years ago when their paths had crossed in darkness and rain. He forgave you, Maria said, when Emily finished her story. That's what Thomas always did. He saw the good in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Emily had expected anger, accusations, demands for justice. Instead, she found herself embraced by a family that had already mourned their loss and moved forward with grace and dignity. Thomas Chen had died knowing that somewhere in the world was a young woman who blamed herself for an accident he had never held against her. The criminal case against Robert Mitchell would continue for years, but Emily's role in it was finished. She had testified truthfully about their encounter, about his confessions and threats, about the evidence he had fabricated to support his fiction about a brother named David. The real evidence, the police reports absolving her of blame, had been sealed away, and Robert's obsessive need to create victims where none existed. Emily kept her job at Chen & Associates, but her relationship with Sarah deepened from professional to personal as the older woman helped guide her through the psychological aftermath of her ordeal. The secret that had defined Emily's adult life was gone, replaced by a hard-won understanding of forgiveness, accountability, and the difference between guilt and responsibility. She would never forget the lesson Robert Mitchell had taught her through his terrible example, that pain left untreated can metastasize into something monstrous, that vengeance masked as justice can destroy the very soul it claims to serve, and that the only path to true healing lies through honest acknowledgement of what we have done and who we choose to become. Emily Rodriguez had spent 5 years running from the truth that would have set her free. She would spend the rest of her life making sure she never made that mistake again. The receptionist who had once hidden behind perfection had learned to find strength in authenticity, peace in accountability, and hope in the radical possibility of forgiveness, both given and received. In the end, that was the only justice that truly mattered, the justice of becoming whole again after being broken by our own choices and fears. Some stories end with punishment, some end with revenge, but the best stories, the ones that matter most, end with understanding, growth, and the quiet courage to live honestly in a complex world where good and evil are rarely as simple as they first appear. Emily's story was one of those rare tales where everyone involved, even the killer who had terrorized her, found their way back to truth, and in that truth, unexpected as it was, lay the only redemption worth having, the kind that transforms tragedy into wisdom, fear into compassion, and guilt into grace.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.